Okay. Let's see if it shows up. Let's check that out. If I have a way to do this. Okay, so it looks like that's that much of a delay. Let's see if I can get rid of that delay because I don't want a weird delay. Okay. Okay, I will be back to the stream. I know no one's watching, but I will be back in 20 minutes. Bye. Okay. So, I'm back. So I'm gonna get started in like, I don't know how long, but definitely we'll get started at some point soon. And yeah, okay. I've had to figure out how this all works. I also was looking over the packet a little bit before this, but this will be my method of studying. So, for academic decathlon, all my stuff to do for this. So, we'll see if anyone starts actually watching, because I'm just talking to myself at this point. So that's nice. But I think that's delete that. Might as well make the oh dear. Okay. Interesting. Okay. Let's see. Analytics. Let's look at the analytics. We are so far at 0 views. How wonderful. Okay. Oh, so I'm just gonna sit back, relax, and wait for someone to join. Maybe. Once we get a viewer, maybe I'll begin. Huh. Still, I feel like this is very much it's very behind. Oh, that's I knew it. Okay. So okay. That's a test to see how far the delay is. Huh. Interesting. Okay, looks good. We still sitting at the 0 viewers. Okay. Once I get 1 viewer, I'm gonna start. Or not. I don't know. That'd be funny. Okay, I'm gonna get started. So, we begin our discussion of neuroscience with the nervous system. Neuroscience, study of the nervous system. Simple as that. The idea of the nervous system, it's all about communication. This can definitely come up on the tests. This is just like, I think we even had a question like this. What's the main role of the nervous system? Communication. That's all it is. Your body talking to itself, or outside things talking to your body. So we have lots of different subcategories that can kind of like blend with neuroscience in a way, and those are molecular biology, cell biology, physiology, chemistry, physics, psychology, cognitive science, computer science, and mathematics. So those are just like the kinds of problems they might ask you is like, which of the following is not a field of science that intersects with neuroscience? And it gives you like cell biology, physiology, uh, computer science, mathematics, and English. Now, it's not going to be that obvious, but like English. So you might have this answer that you have to figure out what is not, especially with these long lists of like things that it tells you. So then we can go ahead and talk about neurons. Neurons are nerve cells. It's just cells in your body that are sending signals, doing this communication, like we said earlier, with one another so that we can, well, do anything pretty much. And so what's very interesting about the neuron is it can't really regenerate, except for certain kinds. So we'll get into those later, but neurons, it's called neurogenesis, and they cannot undergo neurogenesis. Think about the root of what the word neurogenesis means. Neuro meaning neuron, and genesis meaning like birth, so the birth of new neurons. And we can talk about this in a lot of different ways, but the most prominent is in the context of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, which we will talk about, let's see, right here, central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. So there's differences in this neurogenesis between each of the different things neuron does. So then we talk about the parts of the neuron. So this is fun. So we can use this diagram here. Okay. And this diagram is a good example of just like what it actually looks like. It's got its soma, which is its cell body. Soma means cell body. And this is also just true for anything. Soma just means body. And we then also have these other parts called dendrites and axons. So this chart doesn't relay them like as separately as a lot of different figures do, which is why I like to use like a different diagram that it provides. So if we take a look here, this is probably a better example of a neural cell or a nerve cell. And this is the cell body. It's like it can be many different shapes actually. And we have, actually there are some things that it doesn't show on this that are actually pretty important. So we have the dendritic arbor are these like sections leading out to the actual dendrites. So part of these, they're also made up of, like, they have different segments going out of them. So see how one dendrite can extend into the next, and they expand more than this image shows. Like, this image is probably a better example of how they branch off a lot. And what dendrites do is they receive a signal from another neuron. And remember, we're looking at neuroscience from this lens of communication. So we have the cell body and the dendrites, which explained. Now, the nucleus is where all the data processing is happening. Like, essentially, DNA's in there, and it's being formed into proteins or different signal molecules. So if they might ask you a question like, where are signal molecules for the neurons formed? Well, the soma is going to be that place because it starts here in the body. The body is producing everything. And then it starts to travel down in order to send a signal down what's called the axon. Now, this is the axon hillock. And the axon hillock is where the signal like begins, and it's able to form it. So the action potential is begun at the axon hillock. And then it goes into the axon, which is this long, good old, like, snake tail. It's a tail type of thing. And we have, like, these different segments that are, like, broken up. It seems like they're broken up into segments, right? But really, it's all just one, like, long, like, thing of membrane that transmits a signal. And these things surrounding them, it's called myelin sheaths, made out of myelin. Myelin has a white color, so that's going to be demonstrated with, like, the color of the brain and, like, what different parts look like. So, like, white matter is going to be made up of the myelinated axons because myelin is white, while the somas or bodies are typically like a gray or a tan. That's why it's called a gray matter. So then we have the different, like, parts of the axon as it goes down. So not only do we have the myelin sheaths, the purpose of these, by the way, is to conduct the signal, to let it move along. And then the signal just moves throughout the axon, and there are these little segments in between. Those are called the nodes of the Ranvier, and it's where different signaling molecules can be let in or let out. So, like, as you can see, like, there are these gaps. They allow inside to gain access to the fluid outside the cell, which is important for sending electrical signals. Okay, so then we also have the end of it, which is the axon terminal. It's the very end, the terminal. I heard a good analogy the other day, and it was like the axon terminal is where, like, the terminal is where the planes are. They are in the terminal so that they can fly off and go to a different place, similar to how the axon terminal is where signaling molecules leave the nerve cell or neuron and go through these little synapses and attach to another neuron. So as you can see here in this image, these little axon terminals and synapses are synapsing with the dendrites. And so we have, like, the question may also be, okay, well, how are neurotransmitters, they're called, these signaling molecules, like, leaving the actual synapse? Well, they have these things called vesicles. So what vesicles are, they're like little spheres of lipids or fats, and they do they put together molecules in, like, little packages. In this case, the neurotransmitters are in the packages. Then, of course, in order to receive, we need to have some sort of reception mechanism, shown here, some sort of reception mechanism in order to get these neurotransmitters. Now, we have this in-between part that we've discussed of the neuron. Now, this is called the synaptic cleft because it's a little gap between the actual synapse of one nerve cell and the usually dendrite of another. Now, in order to like name, oh, what's the one sending the signal and what's the one that's receiving the signal, we have the presynaptic neuron and we have the postsynaptic neuron. The presynaptic neuron is the nerve cell that has the signaling molecules, and these signaling molecules come out of it. So in the presynaptic neuron, it's the first, so like pre or before, it goes into the synaptic cleft, and then we have the postsynaptic neuron, which is the one receiving the actual signaling molecules, aka neurotransmitters. So that is probably my best explanation of the actual morphology or the structure of a neuron, and like the structure of a basic neuron. But now we can go ahead and discuss these different like shapes of neurons. So specifically in like figure 5 here, it likes to show these different types. So what's important to realize in neuroscience is often there are two factors that influence the actual like function of a neuron. There is the location in the body, and there is the actual morphology or like shape. And we can use these things to determine, okay, what actually is this doing? Because we can just say, oh yeah, we have neurons in our brains and they talk with each other, you know, that's how I think. So it's understanding, hey, if we can understand the brain, then we can understand all of these other parts of our bodies so that we can help treat diseases and help like just understand our world better. Bit of a side tangent there, sorry. But we have these 3 different types usually of neurons. So we have A here, which is a motor neuron. As you can see, it's most similar to the example we saw earlier in the fact that it has its dendrites, it has the dendritic spines coming off of the dendrites where they actually synapse with other neurons. And then we have our soma, where all those neurotransmitters are being produced. We have our myelinated axon, which is where all those neurotransmitters are being sent. And then we also have our actual like axon terminal, where the axon ends. Then we have our special interneurons here. And they don't really have much of an axon. They kind of just like flow. Like a lot of signals are being sent all over the place. And these are important because they kind of act as this like this middle ground between a molecule that's like sending a neuron, sorry, that is sending a signal and one that's receiving it. These are usually able to like either like alternate the signal or the neurotransmitters or whatever's being sent and maybe redirect them or form new connections. So you can think of these as like the all-reaching, the interneuron. They have all these forces within them. Then we have C, which is a sensory neuron. As you can see, it is different than these, but it's similar to the interneuron because it has the soma in the middle, but it's similar to the motor neuron because it has axon, or kind of axons, kind of. It's more like one axon. But what this is important for doing is like relaying signals from which it's already received a transmitter, and it's trying to specifically say, hey, you muscle over here, I'm signaling you because I got a signal, so you better like move. So like, yeah, move. So we have each of these different types. They work to connect neurons, and they're actually often quite small, as it mentions here. Then we have So we talked about gray matter and white matter earlier. This is the idea that myelin, it's like stained white, and the gray matter, it's the cell bodies, which tend to be more like of a tan. So let's see if I missed anything. It's mostly, yes, okay, so in the brain, as you can see in this diagram, the white is on the inside and the gray is on the outside. This is going to come into play if they ask you a question about like, hey, so with the cerebral cortex, which type of matter is most prominent? And you're going to want to say that's gray matter, because gray matter is the thing on the inside, and the cerebral cortex is the outside layer of the brain, this outside layer where the general functions are happening, like where signals are being received and then retransmitted, usually because of those somas, because that's where the neurotransmitters are being produced, remember? Then we have the actual spine, the spinal cord, and it's actually swapped in the spinal cord. We have the white matter on the outside and the gray matter on the inside. So this means that all the somas are going to be packed really tight in the middle, and all the axons that are sending the signals are on the outside. We'll see this in a lot of different signaling pathways, especially when it has to do with like the somatosensory system and the motor system. Both of these are very prominent in discussing the spinal cord. So that was a lot. We can go ahead and just like breathe for a second. That was a lot to take in. For now, we can just see, okay, what have we reviewed? We've reviewed the actual neurons, and we've reviewed what is in the brain. Okay, so we move on to the idea that neurons, they aren't the only part of the nervous system. I'm gonna really quickly check if I have, okay, nobody's saying anything. I need to message this person. Let's see. Let's see if I can add something here. We're just gonna take a little break for just a millisecond. I wonder why. Huh. Okay. Okay. Let's move on. So, we now can move on to glia. We can talk about this other part of the nervous system, which is often ignored, because when they were first being discovered, these different parts, these glial cells, they were first just thought, oh, they're the glue between the neurons, because we usually just look at the neurons and we're like, oh, look, there's these other cells in here, but they're kind of just in between, and we don't really know what they do, so we're just going to kind of assume that they don't really do anything, when actually they're really, really important to the nervous system, yes. So, they are non-neuronal cells, not neurons, and they are 4 different types, right? Yeah. 4 different types usually that we're going to discuss, at least. We have the astrocytes, the oligodendrocytes, we have the Schwann cells, and we have the microglia. Okay? So, those names are really scary, but I found that if you think about them, like, their name kind of, like, sounds like what they're doing, and you can make these little connections. For example, with the oligodendrocytes, which we're going to talk about right now, the oligodendrocytes, they're kind of funky. Like, the name, it's funky. So I think, oh, it's kind of weird. it's also like, I think, okay, weird and specific, okay? Since it's long, it must be specific. So in this case, it is specific to usually just about one job. This one job is myelinating axons. And so this is a very, very important job in the nervous system. However, it's also shared, okay? Both of these different types of cells, Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes, both share the job of myelinating axons. But we discussed earlier the idea that there's this central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, but we never really got into what they are, and we will soon, don't worry. But all you need to know for now is that oligodendrocytes, they myelinate axons in the central nervous system. So this is kind of reviewing like, hey, what is an axon again? It's the thing that sends the neurotransmitters through it. It's the part of the neuron. And it needs this myelin in order to transmit a signal. So it takes these neurotransmitters, sends them, and faster too. So that's what the oligodendrocytes do. And it's in the central nervous system. So for brief explanation, just to ease your nerves, it's just the brain and the spine, not anything else, or the spinal cord. And then the Schwann cells, Schwann myelinates axons in the peripheral nervous system. I imagine for some reason the name like Schwann, it's kind of like this extra guy who's like sitting in the corner and he's just going about his day, like, and he's in the side or peripheral nervous system, and he's like in the back corner where like not many people see him and not many people know about him, but like he's there. Schwann. There you go. Character Schwann. So he's in the peripheral nervous system, just making his axons, his little, or not making the axons, sorry, making myelin for the myelin sheaths, which conduct the signal of the axon. Okay, now we can talk about probably my favorite, astrocytes. It's a lot of people's favorite. So, I'm gonna guess. I don't know. I haven't had conversations with people about this. That's kind of sad too. Okay, well, astrocytes, they are named for their star-like appearance, as it says here, and they have many, many different jobs, but the main ones explained here are regulating signals and forming what's known as the blood-brain barrier. Okay, that's good. Interacting with chat here, or a chat. Good. Okay. You know who you are, who I'm talking to. Okay. So we have, where was I? Okay. That really distracted me. Okay. So astrocytes, they are making up the signaling, like they're allowing for signaling to happen and the blood-brain barrier to form. So what are these things? We have neurons that are connected with each other, and we have synaptic clefts, right? And the synaptic clefts can have these signals that the signal molecules, it doesn't always just go directly to the next cell or the postsynaptic cell. The signals from the presynaptic cell don't always go to the postsynaptic cell. And they are instead taken up by things like astrocytes, which regulate the chemical makeup of this synapse. And so we have all of these different molecules in there, and if they get too much or too little, then these astrocytes are going to come in and they're like, we're the stars of the show, right? And that's how you can remember it, because they're the astrocytes and they're there to win. I don't know. They also form the blood-brain barrier, which covers a lot of the neurons and separates them from blood, thus blood-brain barrier. You can also remember that astrocytes are doing this specifically, by looking at, okay, we have the astrocytes which wrap around the neurons, and they're kind of like the blood is more just like touching them. They aren't, or like just, I imagine an analogy of like the stars, right? So like people pay attention to stars. They don't really pay attention to the people that are kind of like behind the stars, like in the corner. Um, and so these astrocytes are covering up the neurons from the blood, and they stop different like dangerous molecules that could get into the neurons. We don't want that. So it restricts it to keep the brain healthy. And this kind of acts as also like a double-edged sword, because we as people like have discovered, oh, we have medicines, we can treat people, oh yeah, with brain diseases. It's really easy, just give them drugs to help them. Now, not bad drugs, prescription drugs, don't do drugs, okay? Also, we have this problem that the astrocytes are trying to protect us, but we are trying to also protect ourselves. So we take these prescription drugs to try and help our neurons, but they don't work. This is why, because of the blood-brain barrier. Usually, different medications will go into your blood stream and not be able to get into the neurons because of this. Now, there is a different story, however, in the peripheral nervous system, which, if you recall, it's not the brain or the spinal cord. And that's why injuries to the spinal cord or brain are often very hard to treat. And so in the peripheral nervous system, everywhere else doesn't have this blood-brain barrier. So we're good to like try and treat our own bodies with medication because it's not restricted to the neurons. Okay, so what we also have is, oh yes, I already talked about how it was once believed that glial cells, including astrocytes, were thought to just kind of be there. They're the side guy. No one saw that they were doing all this hard work myelinating axons and protecting your neurons from all the dangerous blood. And there are really all these things that we've discovered in pretty recent times, and it's nice to know all of this about it, because then we can find more treatments and find more just different ideas. Okay, so now we can talk about microglia, which are smaller than most glial cells. What a surprise. Micro means small. Okay, so they're really important because microglia, they are the formation of the immune system of the brain. So like, I one moment, I love the immune system. Got the Kurzagot, or I don't know how to say the name, and I wish to learn, but okay, immune system, just connect this image with this image, okay? It'll help to learn. I don't know, like just like take a screenshot of this in your mind so that you remember microglia, immune cells, okay? Yeah, so that's that. Now my bookshelf is ruined, but it was worth it, wasn't it? Okay. Hope you all are enjoying me struggling badly. Okay. So, we now have the microglia, which it protects from. This lists toxins, diseases, and invaders. So, this is a little different than the astrocytes, because it's not just protecting it, it's also removing old cells. And or dead or just bad neurons that are hurting you. And it's not just like stopping things from coming in, it's like legitimately like active in stopping bad molecules from hurting your neurons, or even just bacteria or whatever. Now, there is a catch. Microglia also have this double-edged sword, just like astrocytes. You starting to see a pattern here? Where yes, they protect, but if they get too hyperactive, then they can get dangerous and they create inflammation or swelling in the brain, and they could cause neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer. I feel bad that I can't pronounce it very well. But yes. So then we can actually talk about, not on this small scale, but on a larger scale, we can look at, okay, what is the central nervous system, and like as a whole. We don't just look at the neurons, we look at the entire like section of the system as a whole. What is it forming? Remember earlier I talked about how we need to look at where neurons are and where different cells in the nervous system are, like where they're located, and then we also need to know like what they look like, their shape, or their, as this puts it, morphology. Okay, so we are now going to look at the system as a whole, the central nervous system. Okay, and so it's a very direct, and it's your brain and your spinal cord. It's sending out the signals, taking in signals, processing them. I want you to think about one thing right now. Okay, so that was your central nervous system. Yeah. So hopefully that makes sense. I mean, it's a pretty simple idea. It's just a section. So now we get into, okay, our brains are pretty important. Like, without them, we just wouldn't be who we are. We wouldn't live, obviously. And so we need protection. This is where the meninges come in from. So we have these different layers. I think it's perfect to just like look at this chart for now and not worry about the bunch of text above, because it pretty much just explains what it looks like and some of the functions, which I will get into. So we have the epidural space, which is the top layer right below the bone. And then we have the dura mater, or the dura mater. I don't know how to say it, but I just know it's not mater. It's a different word because it only has one T. And then we have the subdural space, the arachnoid matter, the subarachnoid space, and the pia mater. And then there's the brain. Okay, so with the epidural space, this is where medications can typically be entered into. So if someone's having a problem with their brain, this actually is typically the place where help can be administered. And so then we have the dura mater, which its primary use is to absorb shocks. So if you get hit in the head like really hard, right? Most people aren't gonna just like a hit, okay? Not even that hard, but just a hit. It protects your brain from like legitimately getting all the effects of that hit, because brain's pretty fragile. And so it acts as this kind of layer to protect and to how does it put it? It allows for the absorption of shock. Then we have the subdural space, which is the next layer, but it's not often really recognized unless you have serious trauma to the head, in which case blood can flow down from that dura mater in order to it flows down in there. And that's one of the effects of an injury. And then below the subdural space, we have the arachnoid matter. So the arachnoid matter is this webby sort of area where it can once again allow for just more protection of the brain. Then we have the subarachnoid space, okay? So the subarachnoid space is this part just below the arachnoid matter, which is kind of formed in it. The subarachnoid space, it's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So what that is it's the fluid that that regulates the central nervous system and just the brain as a whole. And we'll get into it later, but the cerebrospinal fluid gets in here through little vents in the brain, as you call them. And so this is important for the flow of molecules and different actually I don't know if it has to do with the flow of molecules, but it's mostly just keeping it afloat and keeping it regulated. So yeah, it also lets blood vessels access the brain, so that it accesses the brain. Then we have the pia mater, which is this small layer that kind of just covers the brain. Now, let's talk about some Latin, shall we? So, as you probably saw if you just saw what the different text was, we have the different, Latin is very important to lots of science, and so we can easily figure out what each part is or where it is, and this helps us memorize by just using the names. So dura mater, okay? Dura mater literally in Latin means tough mother, okay? So it means it's a tough outer layer that's ready to take on the challenges. It keeps that brain from taking too much of that shock of the punch, and it's going to absorb that shock. So that's the strong mother. Then we have the pia mater, which is the gentle mother. And this can also help you in remembering, okay, well, it's very smooth along the creases of the brain. This is really important because we can't let any of that fluid from the subarachnoid space into the brain. Otherwise, the neurons could get very easily messed up, because this is also where blood is coming in, nutrients. It needs to go to very specific places for it all to function well. So, that's the meninges. I think it's pretty, important. So then we're gonna take a break, just process that real quick. I am going to check something. Okay. Looks good. Okay. So, now we are going to look at the lobes of the brain, which it's just separation of the brain. So, let's do this pretty quickly because I don't want to waste all the time in the world on just things that are easily memorized. And I want to get to the stuff that's hard to understand. So we have two cerebral hemispheres, which, if you think, just the cerebrum is just the main part of the brain as a whole. It's what you think of when you get the brain. It's this whole part. Then we have the cerebellum, which really has to do with the motor coordination and motor functions. And then we have the brainstem, which usually is this communication grid between the different senses and different actions with the brain and cerebellum. fun fact, the cerebellum actually has more neurons than the actual cerebrum has. It's more dense with those neurons. And I think it tells exactly how much later on. But we have then these different parts of the. Let's talk about the cerebrum first. There are two different like names for what like the bumps and the folds, and when you think of a brain you think really wrinkly, right? And so you have the bumps are called the gyri, okay? Or the gyrus is singular, so a single gyrus is a bump, and then the sulci is the fold in the brain, so that you have folds and bumps on your brain. And then we have a mention of how the brain is a very large surface area, and the wrinkles and bumps allow it to be compact into our small little heads. And so they're usually similar from one person to the next, which just means like you can divide the brain into sections easily using these folds and bumps. Okay, so now let's talk about the different lobes of the cerebrum, which are the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Okay, so in the frontal lobe, it's the biggest, and so it does all your thinking stuff. So we have listed here decision making, logical problem solving, future planning, emotion, attention, inhibition or prevention of unwanted behaviors, speech production, and social behaviors. So that's a lot, but essentially it's just like when you think, that's your frontal lobe. When you have ideas, like you're like, oh, I want to do this soon, or oh hey, how am I gonna be able to get through this day? What am I gonna have to do to go through? It's this planning. Now, teenagers like me, we don't have very developed frontal lobes, and this is why oftentimes we find that it's hard to make proper decisions. We are more inclined to just make the rapid and instinct decision, the decision based on your instinct. And so it's easy for us to get distracted. It's easy for us to do the wrong thing when we don't even realize. And so we're just more willing to take these risks, okay? And this is part of human development in general, because it's important for us to make mistakes because then we learn from them. Especially in this period of growth, we learn from our hardships. So we then also have the parietal lobe, which is the next part. It's right behind the frontal lobe. So if you go from here to about here, that's going to be your parietal lobe. And this usually processes different the actual senses, and specifically touch, temperature, pain, body position, all of this, and skin and organs. These are all important to realize that this is what it's processing. And we realize that it's also part of spatial relationships, and it contains this somatosensory cortex also, which we'll talk about later. And we also have the motor cortex, which it's located right around here in the frontal lobe / parietal lobe. And so earlier we also talked about the frontal lobe. We also have the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is where you make all your decisions that I was talking about. But then in the back of the frontal lobe is the motor cortex. And then we have the occipital lobe, which it's just your visual. I think ocular, so like occipital and ocular. Ocular means like visual, like things you can see. And the occipital lobe, that's what it functions for. And it's in the very back. Then we have our temporal lobe, which it's like, I think, okay, what the temporal lobe does is it's usually like auditory stuff. And it does have some object recognition that comes from the occipital lobe. But we'll get there also later. So we have the temporal lobe that's taking in the auditory signals. And how I like to remember this is tempo. Tempo is a musical thing. It's the like the speed at which a beat happens. And kind of it's my off the spot explanation, but I think tempo, sound, like music, and it's on the side of your brain where your ears are. Okay, so then we also have the cerebellum, which is Latin for little brain. So it's like a little version of the bigger cerebrum, and it is concerned. Okay, it doesn't say how many more neurons, but it has more neurons. So it's primarily concerned with the motor system, which can allow for coordinated movement. So think about it. Oftentimes, it's easier to learn a skill with like movement or like being able to, say, ride a bike. If you just practice it, you don't have to remember how to ride a bike. You just need to practice it over and over, and your brain gets it down. That's your cerebellum. So your cerebellum is the thing doing all that learning. That's why it needs so many neurons, because it's all in your subconscious. Like, oh, I know how to ride a bike. Now my body just naturally does it, you know? It's all about the practice. And so we use our cerebellums to do that. Okay, then we have the parts of the, like, under the surface of the cerebrum. So we have our cerebral cortex, which is the outer layers and all of the gray matter, but then, and it goes into the white matter. And then we have all these, like, separate parts that are kind of scattered throughout the middle of your brain. So we have, let's start with the amygdala. It's found in the temporal lobe, so like right here on the green part. And the amygdala, it looks kind of like an almond, and its shape and size are because of an almond. It actually comes from the Greek word for almond, amygdala. And what it does is it like helps with emotion and fear, and it allows for all these different emotions that you have. And so it's also part of this system, this larger system known as the limbic system. The limbic system is just that part for emotion. And so then we have like how emotions and emotional memory. So emotions can also be connected to memory, and lots of the amygdala is found in parts with gray matter or nuclei. So if you recall, gray matter is like the somas, right? It's also known as nuclei because the somas, if you remember, have the nucleus within them. Thus why they are called nuclei. Okay. So we also have the hippocampus, which and we're going to discuss the hippocampus specifically in like a mini section later down the line. And it's really important for long-term memory. But it's also part of the limbic system, and it does have some to do with like emotion, but it's mostly it's mostly doing stuff having to do with memory. Okay, so we also know that the hippocampus really helps us understand how like the brain is changing. This circuitry is changing, and this is a really important topic within neuroscience. It's known as neuroplasticity, and it's the ability of the brain to create new connections and new like new connections which allow you to learn and produce these memories, which the hippocampus does. You might be able to memorize a series of numbers like 15712, and you might remember that for a second, but if you don't keep thinking about it, like I've already forgotten the numbers because I've stopped thinking about them. And what the hippocampus does is it translates them into long-term memory. So like memory consolidation is what it's called. It takes the memories that are sent straight up to your brain and also like organizes them. So it tells you, hey, you're this kind of memory. You are reasoning right now, this kind of memory. You're trying to work like through how to do stuff. Well, I'm going to send you down to the frontal lobe because that's what the frontal lobe does. So then it goes and sends it. This is called memory consolidation, where it's changing the short term to the long term. Then we also have the movies Memento and 50 First Dates, which this packet uses as examples for this idea of memory consolidation being hurt if both of your hippocampi, I think that's the word for it, if both of them are like damaged or just removed, then you aren't going to be able to consolidate those memories and make new long-term memories. And so there might be a question like, which of the following Hollywood movies talk about memory consolidation? And you can be like, aha, I know, it's Memento and 50 First Dates, because in Memento, the person forgets their memento, and in 50 First Dates, it's pretty obvious that, well, you can't always have 50 first dates, and it might be with the same person, so you forget about it, and so you have these two that you can remember. Okay, then we move on to the thalamus, which it's like a relay station. So what I like to imagine is it's like one of those soundboards where you can move the like the different sound key things up or down. And then we have our oh yes, so everything goes through the thalamus except for smell. Smell goes directly to your brain, which is often why it's like it's very like important to our brains, because like if we can smell, then we're going to be able to smell if there's like a fire coming on, and that's pretty important. Okay, so we know that it also like has lots of these different sections, and it helps with almost everything. It's like consciousness, emotional behaviors, motor control, and cognition, all of this. It's like frontal lobe stuff, and amygdala stuff, and even hippocampus stuff. If it's emotional behaviors, it's still part of the limbic system, kind of. The thalamus is not, but remember, the amygdala and the hippocampus are both part of this. And then we have the hypothalamus. I should have probably been showing you where each of these things are. So there's the thalamus, there's the hippocampus, and there's the amygdala. Where is the image? There's no image of where the hypothalamus is, but we can see, okay, there's the thalamus. It's right below there. And so let's take a look. Okay, so we then go to what is the pituitary gland. And this is in the name, it's a gland. So it's usually releasing these signals or hormones that allow different like processes to happen over your brain. And homeostasis, this wonderful word, is going to be very important. Well, it just is in biology in general. It's this idea that your body holds balance. It's staying in balance with the force. Yes. So we have these different hormones that regulate that. So if you're in a very dangerous, that's not a good example. A better example might be like perfect example, teenagers. They're going through puberty, they're experiencing a lot of hormones because they're undergoing change in their bodies so that their bodies may stay stable. Then we keep it balanced. Yes, we talked about that. It regulates body temperature, blood pressure, hunger, thirst, sleep, and wakefulness, crucial to survival. So it's all about survival with homeostasis. Okay, then we finally get to talk about the basal ganglia, which are these parts of the nuclei, or these nuclei that, remember, nuclei are the gray matter, which are also the somas of the neurons. So those are all one and the same. And we have these different structures, the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. And all of these will be discussed later, so I'm not going to go in depth. But you need to know that those are the parts. There's also more parts to it than just that. But for simplification sake, there's also the subthalamic nucleus and the substantia nigra. And then, yeah, so both of these are usually more towards the midbrain. And the upper parts, like the caudate nucleus, putamen, and globus pallidus, are near the thalamus. So they're important for like bodily movement. So, for example, if you are like twitching a lot, then this may not be working because usually it's the basal ganglia are working to prevent these spastic movements. These like ooh, like imagine if your body was shaking all the time, just randomly. There's actually specific example of Parkinson's disease, and the substantia nigra degenerate, and this like ruins the basal ganglia. So they have more rigidity and difficult initiating movements. So not only does it regulate these little like tremors that your body has, but it also like has motivation. So like it gives you motivation. Imagine if like when you're thought of like doing homework, like what the basal ganglia is doing is it's going and telling you, hey, go do your homework. It's essentially saying that to the muscles. You could like think, I really want to move my muscle right now, but your body could be like, yeah, no, not right now. But the basal ganglia is telling it, no, you're gonna move your arm up. You're gonna move it down because I said so. So those are the basal ganglia. And then we have these yes, as I talked about in Parkinson's disease, it's more rigid because it's hard to initiate movements. It also helps in motor learning, cognition, behavior, and emotion. Okay, so all of that is also right next to the brainstem, but we're going to take a break really quick because I have to go real quick. So I will be right back. I'm going to update my text. I'll probably be less than 5 minutes. And we will continue our discussion on the brainstem and then the spinal cord and then ventricular system and then peripheral nervous system, and that's it. So we're already almost done with section 1 of science, so this is really good. We're on good pace, so good job. Okay, so I am going to turn off my camera real quick and my audio, so I'll be right back. Okay, so I am back. Let's go ahead and change the text. Okay. Okay, so we are back with the brainstem and the spinal cord. Now, we don't have all night to do this, so I'm gonna quickly go through each of the parts, especially because I want to get to neural communication, and I want to get to sensory motor systems, and I want to get to this last section. So it's pretty important that we try and speed this up. So I'm going to go ahead and just like briefly explain each of these parts. Okay, so we have the midbrain, pons, and medulla, the three parts of the brain stem. And the midbrain helps with eye movements and pupillary light reflex, and it like this means that it constricts the pupil. This is like a reflex. So when you see something really bright, think about it like when you go outside, your eyes close off a little bit so that you don't get over blinded by the amount of light. Then we have the pons, which is the middle section, which is kind of weird because it's like midbrain. Wouldn't that be the middle section? No, the pons is the middle section. The midbrain is more of the middle of the brain, while the pons is kind of outside of the brain, and it's the middle of the brain stem. And also, please note, although the thalamus is at the top of the brainstem, only the midbrain, pons, and medulla are part of the brainstem. Okay, so then the pons, they are like a bridge. They coordinate different movements, so like facial movements, chewing muscles, hearing, and balance. So you think about it like you start with the midbrain, which is eyes, and then you go to your cheeks, which is the pons, which is like facial movements, and then chewing muscles, so like so that's on the outside, and then hearing, it goes back more, and then balance, which is inside of your ears. So you can think of it as just this this inward movement around the head. And then we have the medulla, which are also for the face. So we kind of go back from the ears, straight back onto all the face. If you touch your face, your medulla is going to be processing that. It's also going to process like swallowing food, vomiting, and blood pressure and heart rate and other functions. So think about these knee-jerk reactions that it just happens kind of naturally. Well, that's what the medulla is going to be recognizing, or just like these background kind of functions like blood pressure and heart rate. And then there's it just makes a note here that both white and gray matter are present in the brainstem. They don't go away. They're both there, so we need axons and somas in order to allow for the signal to run. Okay, so then we have the spinal cord. Okay, the spinal cord is made up of vertebrae or backbones. Okay, and as you will see here, we have lots of these little tiny segments. We have the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, and the sacral. So for the cervical, you can think, okay, your cervix, right? It's like more up here. Your thorax or your thoracic. If you think of thorax, you can think of the thorax and how he wants to speak to your heart. That's kind of where your thoracic spinal cord is. It's like around this area. It's like the more of the middle area. It's the upper middle area. And the thorax wants to talk to your heart, just like the thorax is near your heart. The thoracic. That's what I think of it. And then we have the lumbar, which we get like it's like how chairs like to advertise the lumbar support. Oh yes, we have lumbar support. Well, that's your like lower-ish back. It's like that segment where it's kind of weird, like you can't always like feel right there. Like it's sometimes when you slouch, it can feel less good. Well, yeah, this is lumbar support. And then we have our sacral, which is this very end point. Yeah, so sacral, all that. Then we have the ventricular system, which is kind of tricky, but it's pretty cool. And we tend to neglect the idea that there's this cerebral spinal fluid flowing through our brains at all times. That is keeping it afloat in your head, and it's kind of like sending different molecule stuff and keeping it like regulated, that idea of homeostasis. So we have let's just look at the diagram, okay? Because there are like, it's kind of confusing, the text, so we're just gonna follow a path of the diagram, okay? So what we need to know is that it's called the choroid plexus. That's where cerebrospinal fluid is going to be flowing out of, is this choroid plexus. See this like orange thing? That's kind of what it is. And then it moves into this lateral ventricle. Okay, it's called lateral ventricle. And it could be on the right side or the left side. And so don't be confused if it says right or left. It's just different parts of your brain, or different sides of your brain. Because remember, your brain is in half. And then we have the intraventricular foramen, or IVF, I think it's also called. Let's double check that. I think it's the IVF. I just remember it as IVF. Interventricular foramen. And then we have the third ventricle. So for some reason, naming people decided like, hey, you know, we're gonna say it's the third ventricle. It's probably because there's a right lateral ventricle and there's a left lateral ventricle, so those count as two. And then we have a third ventricle, which it flows into, and then it goes down this path and it can go around the cerebellum, and it also has this opening, the lateral aperture, which just redirects the flow back, kind of just like, it's like a leak guider. It like allows for this cerebrospinal fluid to just flow back. It regulates the flow. Then we have the fourth ventricle, which is this lower part, which is connected to the third ventricle via the cerebral aqueduct. Then we have the median aperture, which allows for cerebrospinal fluid to go down one side of the spinal cord and go around the cerebellum. Now, also can take another path through the central canal, but that's not going to lead back up into the brain. So, in addition, we have it flowing back up from the cerebellum, back into the choroid plexus, and around through this subarachnoid space. If you recall, this is kind of where a lot of it was flowing. And also, if you can see here, we have more cerebrospinal fluid coming up from the spinal cord. So if you can imagine, it just goes down and then loops back up into the brain. And then we have these, and it also goes around to here. So see how this section, it also overlaps, because remember, we're 3D creatures. We aren't in a 2D plane, luckily, so it's not as simple as this. Okay, so then if you remember the meninges, you'll remember that we had the subarachnoid space, which is pretty important. It has the cerebrospinal fluid flowing throughout it. And then we also have the arachnoid granulations, which allow the cerebral spinal fluid to go into the superior sagittal sinus, which you just need to remember it's the next layer up outside of all the meninges. Now, if you recall about the why is it not wanting to get there? About the subarachnoid space, it's also able to send molecules into the brain. So that's why it's so close, and it's also important that, see, the superior sagittal sinus, it sends the molecules down into the brain via the subarachnoid space. And then we have our arachnoid granulations, which you can remember by just, it connects to the arachnoid membrane, and it goes, like, it flows into the superior sagittal sinus. And that's the ventricular system. It just helps, like, continually keep the brain fresh with what it has. So then it also the signaling chemicals in the brain, they can get like old and worn out and cause toxins or infectious particles. We don't want that. So cerebral spinal fluid, it gets rid of it. Okay, so it regulates the brain essentially. Okay, and then we have the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so I made a different video explaining that, which I can put on this, like, I can upload that video to the YouTube channel if possible. I don't know if I will be, but it's a very in-depth explanation of the peripheral nervous system. The basic idea is it's separated into the somatic and the autonomic system, and the autonomic system is then further divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. You can remember that the somatic nervous system, if you think of soma, that's body, it's going to be doing actions, and it also is going to have, like, you are choosing to do those actions. Then we have the autonomic nervous system, which it has, like, it's these involuntary. So your heart beating, you aren't saying to your heart, hey, heart, keep beating. No, your autonomic nervous system automatically does that. Remember, this is regulated by the different parts of your brain, like we talked about the like the pons, I think specifically, or the pons was the connecting one, but it also does, okay, no, not the pons, my bad, the medulla, also known as the medulla oblongata. And then we have the midbrain, yes, because remember, we go through our face and then back to our face and the heart rate. But then we also have these different ideas of homeostasis. Anyways, the autonomic nervous system regulates all of these, like, unknown to our own thoughts parts of our body. And this is further divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic division, which the sympathetic division is the it's like your fight and flight response. That might be a common question on the test. And the parasympathetic nervous system is gonna be your, like, it likes to say rest and digest. So you're resting, it's promoting homeostasis. Now, each of these systems, they are called inhibitory of each other because they have, like, opposite functions. So the sympathetic division, for example, is going to make your heart rate go really fast, while the parasympathetic division is going to slow down your heart rate. So both of these work together to create a balance, aka homeostasis. A couple other details to note is the sympathetic division has this thing called the sympathetic chain, which are these lines that go up the spinal cord that allow for the quick signaling that is needed for this fight and flight. If you get hurt, you need to like punch back right away. You need to know it's happening. And then those are made up of what are called like ganglia. So ganglia right next to the sympathetic chain allow for the molecules to flow into it. Okay, so then we also have the parasympathetic nervous system, which I already talked about. But the ganglia in the parasympathetic nervous system, they are not located right next to the spinal cord. They are like right on your skin or whatever, or right at different random parts of the neuron, because these ganglia or cell bodies, the ganglia are made up of cell bodies. I'm sorry, I failed to mention that. And they allow for the chemical signals. So if you're trying to send a signal to the muscle and you want a strong signal, you might want more cell bodies near that rather than the spinal cord. And it can do that because it's slower, and the parasympathetic division is going to be slower than the sympathetic division. So you can probably see here all of these. They might ask you like which nerve is part of the parasympathetic and sympathetic. You can take a screenshot, I guess, of this, but it's like, or just go to the packet if you have it. And yeah, it's really just the idea that one is like making you like it's exciting your body versus relaxing your body. And so we are done with section 1. Finally, good work. Good work, guys. This was good. We got through section 1. Now would be the time, if you have any questions, to let me know, because we are going to be moving on to section 2, and I am going to have to leave temporarily. So, if you guys have any questions, send them, and we're going to take probably a 10-ish minute break, because I have to do that. So, I will be back, and I will make sure that I'm good to go for studying section 2 so that we can be ready. Okay? Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my stuff, and I will be back.